Hey, Tarik.
Greetings. How are you?
I'm very excited to talk to you. I'm doing well, hanging in there.
As
uh,
we all are.
that's right. So I'm not going to do a long introduction here. I did one in the intro, but I will just remind listeners, Tarik is the Director of Music Programs for the Elma Philanthropy Services, and you have led the expansion of the Elma Music Foundation's portfolio, reach, and impact in the U.S. and in South Africa,
Yes.
primarily with organizations that are using music as a youth development tool, which is how I got
Right.
to you. Absolutely, because we're here in the city. So I'm really excited to talk with you about this next normal because you and I have
Yeah.
had lots of interesting conversations about what makes a healthy nonprofit, what does sustainability look like, and also your career has spanned multiple sectors and multiple roles. So I
Yeah.
think you have a really interesting perspective on how do we sustain, how do we grow, how do we thrive as institutions and as a sector. So I thought we'd just
Yeah.
dive right in.
Let's go.
Awesome. So I hear a lot that there are some real existential threats
hmm
facing nonprofits in the coming months and years because of COVID. Does that resonate with you, or is it a little too histrionic?
No, it resonates. It really, really does. Because there are a couple of things that are just going to squeeze folks. From a very practical sense, I think there's going to be a real funding drought come 2021. I think that the usual suspects are going to be either redirecting their funds or sitting things out. And, I think the scary part is that what we've seen so far in 2020 has been the easy part because there's been so much
Emergency funding.
energy, right, and emergency funding and all those things. I think this time next year, those will not be here. And folks will be figuring out how to keep the lights on. And I think also what it's caused is, or at least what it should have caused, is some introspection from both nonprofits and philanthropy alike, right? So from the nonprofit side, it's really thinking about, okay, well, why do I exist really?
Yeah.
And now how do I exist in this new world, right? And not only do the functions that I intend to serve, are they still relevant, but are my competencies still relevant, right? Are the things that I do well still relevant in this new world? And then I think from a philanthropic perspective, it's okay, well, what was I doing before exactly? And how do I either continue doing or doing it more, or how has this changed my perspective or helped to change my perspective? And I think all of those questions, happening and being asked at the same time are going to cause folks, or at least should cause folks, to take a step back and say, okay, well, maybe we ought to rethink this, or I don't know if we're going to be around, right? Because if you have, especially now, if you've got a nonprofit that's got a relationship with a school, right, your entire future is up in the air, right? Because nobody knows what that's going to look like, particularly not this year, and I don't even believe next year. So I think all of that is going to be in question, and I think it also exposed some of the cracks, right, in this philanthropic industrial complex, right? When you start thinking about the fact that, oh yeah, private philanthropy actually does take up a very small slice of this pie, and it's actually the U.S. government that is the biggest player in the market, and in all its different forms, be it local, municipal, regional, federal, they all pull back, right? And I don't think they're coming back anytime soon, right? So then you start to have some real questions about, okay, well, how do I keep the lights on? Like, where is this money going to come from? So yeah, I think there is a real existential threat, but I don't necessarily think it's fully tragic. I think some of it has been has been in the waiting, right? These are problems that have existed and we've been able to kind of float along on it, but now it's been exposed and we're forced to face all the things that have been happening, right? And when I think about
you raised two interesting, many interesting, but there's sort of two things that you brought up that I want to ask more about. So the first is, and you said it yourself, there's this existential threat, but it's not necessarily tragic.
No.
So I was going to say, I use the word threat. It's not necessarily a threat. I think there's existential questions.
Right.
And, I guess just from all of the work that you've seen in this sector, how should nonprofits feel about the possibility that they may sunset? Like, is it inherently bad for nonprofits to contemplate an end
Yeah.
result of navigating COVID being that they don't exist? And like, is that a mental shift that we need to start making?
Yeah. The short answer is no.
Yeah.
They should not be afraid of it, and in fact, some of them should be embracing this idea that, all right, I'm no longer like what was already a rat race, what was already like this never-ending sort of Sisyphean push, up this treadmill. Suddenly, I don't have to do this anymore, and maybe I can think about focusing my energy someplace else, and someplace else that might be now more important than before because of what's happened.
Exactly.
I think all of those things should be in the cards, right? But again, not being here should always be part of the solution set, right? Because again, I get a lot of folks for many years that have always come and they have this idea for this nonprofit, to which I say, stop, don't. Go look up, go to GuideStar, go somewhere and see how many people got here before you did. And not doing it has to be a part of the solution set, right? So just as any market has indicators that says, hey, these particular players aren't serving us anymore, I think we need to listen to that. Now, I do also think that because the nonprofit industrial complex lacks many of those market mechanisms, it's not always a good way to tell, right, who ought to be here and who ought not to be here.
And a lot of the indicators we often look at
are completely bonkers and backwards, right? So I think it can be dangerous, and it's almost certain that there are some nonprofits that should be here that probably won't be here after a while, and vice versa. Some nonprofits that probably shouldn't be here that will persist. But I do think that there is always room for consolidation, just given the number of nonprofits that have doubled, tripled, and quadrupled up on particular services and even geographies. There, a contraction isn't inherently bad.
How do we make sure that contraction doesn't hit Black and brown leaders harder, as it often does?
Well, the short answer is I don't know, and the other part of that answer
that was the whole point of this conversation.
Yeah, I don't know, and the other part of the answer is it almost certainly will.
Yeah.
Right. That's kind of just going to be it, given the initial conditions, because given the initial conditions, all the data tells us that Black and brown led nonprofits are undercapitalized, under-resourced, and undercapacity.
Yeah.
Right. Meaning that they have far less ability to weather these kinds of storms. Now, that's from a very traditional perspective. But then there's another side of it that says because they are Black and brown led, they are particularly positioned to be resilient and persistent because of who is leading them and why and where they come from and the traditions, skills that they bring to that work, right? So it's a double-edged sword. So I think there's part of us that ought to be looking at, all right, how do we actually nurture the leaders, right? Because I think part of it is, we have these tropes where we're trying to pull from, the for-profit world and VCs and all that stuff. But one of the things that I think is very, very interesting about what, say, venture capitalists do and look at is it's not always just the organization. It's the leadership that they're looking at, right? They're betting jockeys, not horses, right? So when you think about the actual people that are doing this work and where they come from and where they need support and where they need, room to grow, that's what philanthropy ought to be looking at rather than just looking at 990s, right? There are people behind those that really, really matter and have stepped up in enormous ways. So I think it's huge.
Yeah, that was the other thread of your initial thoughts that I wanted to follow up on was the shifting role of philanthropy and the hopefully shifting relationship between philanthropy and their sort of grantee partners or sort of grantees. Do you see that changing in ways that will do what you're highlighting now, sort of emphasize the right things? I mean, I think having been an ED, nonprofit leader, there were definitely foundations that get it, right? That understand the complex constellation of things that go into, successful leadership. And then I think there's some real power dynamics that perhaps emphasize the wrong things, right? The sort of traditional view of nonprofit health that overemphasizes things like networks and how capitalized you are. And what I hear from you is not just that leaders themselves have to think about their work differently, but that philanthropy has to think about who and how they invest in this work differently.
Absolutely. So yes, so I see some of that happening, and it's funny because we're now doing some of the same work at Elmo because we're equally guilty of sort of looking at some of those more traditional markers of success that show up differently, right, in different communities and have implicit bias sort of buried into them, right? And sort of what they look for, why they look for it, and why it will show up in certain places and not others, and don't necessarily indicate the things that you think they do.
That's
right. So when I think about, say, for instance, our, everybody's, rushing to do some DEI work right now. For us, a lot of that DEI work is actually going into our due diligence. How do we due diligence organizations, and then how do we unintentionally and unconsciously disadvantage Black-led and undercapitalized organizations, and how do we stop doing that, right? How do we stop doing that and be conscious about what it is that we're looking for, right? So a big part of the question that philanthropy needs to start asking is, okay, well, why do we want that? And what's the risk if we don't meet this criteria? Right? Those are the two big questions for me. It's why do we want this, and what's the worst thing that can happen, right? Because there is no return on investment. Nobody's going to come for us because we're essentially accountable to no one, right? We're accountable to our benefactors, whomever they be, right? So to that end, we've got a lot of latitude to take quote unquote risks, right? Which are maybe not, right? So the way we calibrate those things and how we contextualize them is going to be huge, right? And because that's how we operate, right? And again, people will say, yeah, it moves at the speed of trust, and philanthropy is about relationships, and all that is great, but again, that unconsciously biases us against folks who do not sit in those networks, right? So how is it that we're building these portfolios? How is it that we're building these pipelines? And what does vetting look like, right? So what is success? So I think a lot of those questions need to be posed in very serious ways, and also the answers of which need to be reflected in how we work. Yeah. Because it's one thing to ask those questions and to be conscious, but if they don't make their way into
decision making,
right? If you don't operationalize them, it's really just a wonderful, navel gazing exercise. But I think now is a time where we can actually change the way some of those relationships are built, and some of those partnerships are managed. But again, even if all of private philanthropy did all that, we're still only looking at a relatively small slice of what's happening. So, I think that then brings up the fact that private philanthropy occupies a much larger space in the zeitgeist than it does in the pie, right? In terms of the capital that's actually ingested, and that's the other place where philanthropy can really take some big strides forward. In
what do you think that looks like?
I don't know. You set the narrative, right? You change the way you talk about and do philanthropy. Like it sounds weird to say it that way, but you just change the way you do some of it, and you really start to treat your potential grantees as
partners. Well, it's interesting. I mean, the way I got to know you is this work we're doing in Brooklyn.
Right.
It really is a 3-year learning lab, right?
Right.
Time to work with this cohort of organizations and say, here's how we think we're defining success. What does growth look like? What does scale look like? Let's hear from you. I think that's one of the reasons I was so excited to find out about your and your foundation's involvement, because it is so rare. And this was before COVID. I mean, and now we have this opportunity to say, oh, what are we hearing from you? What are we learning from you?
But right. Yeah. It was
talking about this.
Yeah. It was definitely, serendipitous, maybe for the wrong reasons. But yeah, I mean, part of the question we asked in going into that work is, where do big, strong nonprofits come from?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. So where do they, I mean, they don't start that way. So where do they come from? Right. And then when you look at it in the context of communities that themselves are underinvested and under-resourced and undercapitalized, then you start to think about, okay, well, like, who's serving the folks here, right? How are we actually trying to solve some of these problems? So, we asked that question in Memphis. I mean, frankly, if I'm being 100% honest, we stole this idea from other parts of our team, and obviously other philanthropy. When we started doing this work on the continent, it was a very similar question. It was like, okay, well, all these big NGOs are great, but who's getting to that town? Who's getting to that village? Who is actually on the ground doing the work right here? Yeah. And we realized that the approach we were taking to those orgs that are 2 million plus or 5 million plus are a very different kind of animal than a $500,000 org, right? Who very well may be doing some amazing work, but is kind of putting together with duct tape. So how do you actually get them the tools that they need? Because that $500,000 org could be, in several years, very, very effective, no matter how big they do or don't become. Exactly. How do you nurture them, right? Because then these are also being built and run by people of and from that community who are thinking about those relationships in different ways. So I think for us, it's now a function of how do we continue to be a productive partner in these ecosystems, and thinking about how to continue to inject what we believe to be a very natural and essential element of the human existence, which is music and art. How do you continue to have that as a tool that you can use to connect folks to what they need?
And you even highlight there, I mean, that's a really great, easy to picture example of a marker that I think traditional philanthropy has often used of success. How big's your budget, right? How large are you? And that is often correlated with, oh, you must be doing the best work if you are $5 million.
Right.
Right. And I mean, that's not even subtle bias. I mean, there's real ways in which that
Absolutely
highlights certain things. And so, it strikes me that the next few months, the next few years, as we come out of, as we navigate and hopefully come out of COVID, we will just have to rethink some of those markers. I mean, organizations are getting smaller, right? And one of the things that I think is really interesting as we talk about equity and what equity looks like in the next normal, a lot of the expertise that we have often pointed to has been correlated with some of these wrong markers, right? We interview the EDs of the $10 million organizations, and they're the ones that are, whose articles are written up. And now, because we're seeing these fissures, this disparate impact on communities, it's the leaders in those communities that people are turning to and saying, wait a minute, you've been on the ground running this $500,000 organization
this whole time.
Help us, right? What can we learn from you?
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating from that perspective, because it's the folks that have been screaming it from the mountaintops that are now finally saying, oh, wow, they were right this whole time.
Let's listen to them.
And so it's that part is fascinating, and I think it's particularly interesting given how difficult it has been for these larger anchor institutions to navigate this really, really complex problems, right? And then I think about schools, and I can't say that I envy, their position right now, because while they play a critical role in every community and sort of how we function at many different levels, there's no good answer as to how they continue to play that role.
That's right.
Right. And right now everybody's sort of trying trying to figure out how that goes, but somehow the community will still have to figure out, no matter what the schools do, the community will have to figure out how to fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
As they always do.
That's
right. And they've always done, right? And it's
the gap bigger, they're going to start taking up even more.
Exactly, right? And it's that slice then that you start to look at, right? Because I know the thing that we're looking at in our portfolio and talking to all our folks is, all right, out of school time used to mean from, 3 o'clock to 7 o'clock. Well, now it's, for half the kids, it's Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. For the other half of the kids, it's Tuesday, Thursday. It's all day, right? So it's a complete redefinition.
Right? It isn't an after-school program.
Yeah, this is a whole different kind of operation that you're going to be asked, right? And a lot of them are going to be conscripted into, filling in the gaps that, the anchor institutions leave behind. So they need the dollars, right? Now it's not a more, right? It's not a less, it's definitely more, right? They've now got to figure out how to keep, a staff and a building open and paid for 3, 4, 5 times as long as they would otherwise normally do, right? And that is not okay, we'll give you extra 10%. That's not how that works, right? So yeah, so and then also to bring it full circle to the topic of the people that run this, again, even in the anchor institutions, you are now asking people to choose between, in some cases, their own kids and other people's kids.
Yeah.
Right. And that is not a thing that I imagine is always front of mind when we're thinking about solving some of these problems. But the folks that are watching your kids during the day got kids. Right. And so they're also, when you start to actually look at it at the human level, then it starts to say, okay, well, how do we make all these things work, right? It's a cup problem, right? And we're just shifting things around, trying to figure out how to cover all the gaps. And, there's folks doing it, and those folks need to be compensated, right? They need to be paid for the work that they're doing. And that is easier said than done, because it's now in a structure that we hadn't imagined before. So we've got to be a little bit more creative about how we think about it.
How we do that. Well, we've come full circle to the idea of people, and I want to wrap up with a really two concrete questions for you.
Yeah.
In your brain. So the first is this idea of leaders, the people who run these organizations.
Yeah.
Sort of operations aside for a moment, if you were to talk to, or as you talk to, because I know you talk to a lot of leaders, as you talk to them in the coming months, what does leadership need to look like? Right, just for them as like people running these organizations, does it need to look different, or is it just more of what they've been doing?
I want to say it depends. And that's not a very good answer, but it really does, right? Because I think what we've seen in COVID so far, and I think we've all seen it in different ways, is it has exposed a lot of leaders, for good and bad, right? It has really shown us who has the ability to navigate complex, pressure-filled, uncertain circumstances, and who hasn't, right? And I think for the folks who have, I think what's important about what leadership looks like is balance and care, right? And when I think about the care element of that, there's a self-care aspect of it that often comes too far down the list. It's funny because I'm talking to you after having taken some time off, and that's important. And the problem is to be able to do that, there are some very real things that need to be in place, right? When we talk about these very sort of clinical terms like undercapitalized and under-resourced and undercapacity, what that looks like is a leader who is not eating 3 meals. What that looks like is a leader that's trying to homeschool and retrain a staff and move all their operations online and get a new contract all in the same day, and they haven't been outside, right? So it's then looking at, all right, how do we provide them the balance and the structures so that they can protect themselves? and so that they are allowed to do the things that they need to do,
Yeah.
right? Both on a personal front, a professional front, and for the organization, right? So how do they continue to sort of be a whole person?
Yeah.
And a lot of that, honestly, just shows up in the budget. I look and I say, okay, well, who's your number two? And how much you paying them? Right? Who are they? How big, how deep is your bench?
Yes.
Right? And how do you maintain that bench? How do you pay that bench? Right? So it's all those pieces then start to come into play. It's like, oh, when folks talk about overhead, right? Because we don't think about personnel as overhead, right? That's your program, right? You're not selling widgets, right? Your program is people. So that's the substance of it. But then when you look at it, you say, okay, well, who are they? How much you paying them, and is it enough, right? Do you have the bench to be able to take a day off, right? Do you have the capacity? So it's how do you make, so leadership then starts to look like, okay, well, how can we fund and actually build the structures and the systems to protect ourselves from the world so we can keep doing the work in a sustainable way.
Yeah, which actually leads to my last question, which is now sort of on the operations side. You talked about, existential questions that organizations need to answer. What's, one piece of advice that you have for leaders about what they need to be asking themselves about their organizations, over the next, say, 9 months? Do I grow my staff? Like, what's one question that they need to ask themselves operationally?
Do my priorities match the reality? Right? So are the things that I am spending time, effort, and money on, are they still the most important things going on right now? Right? Are they the most important things that my community needs? And if they aren't, can I stop doing it? Right? Because a big piece of it is like, the tail wagging the dog. Because now folks they're looking. They're like, oh my God, where's the COVID relief? What does that look like? Sure, we can deliver meals. Wait, we don't have a van. Right? But how do I, right? So are the priorities, are the things that I can do that are the most important, are they lining up with the things that the people that I am, pledging to serve, do they need those, right? And am I meeting those needs? And I think it's just continually asking those questions. I think those are the same questions that I'm asking of myself, right? And like, are the things that we deem more important? I look at, what are the reports that we're asking for? Is this really important? Are these the real things that, like, it's now bringing, it's bringing a lot of that into very, very sharp relief. And what we're asking of new grants, what is it that I really, really need from you and need to know? So I think continually re-examining your priorities and testing them against the reality around you, you just got to keep doing that and just keep doing that. And then when you come up with an answer that, butts up against your initial conditions, then you got some choices to make.
That's right.
You got some choices to make, whether you can shift and where do you shift and how do you do it, right? And in some cases, it's a double down, right? But it's got to be conscious, right? It's got to be thoughtful,
intentional,
to be intentional. How do I continue to meet the needs, right? Because again, I think, and I've said this before, this hasn't really changed a whole lot so much as it has magnified a whole lot, right? It has exacerbated things. And now that we've gotten past the, this will be over in a few weeks phase, right? And we've entered the, we're actually here. Like, this is what it's going to look like.
Yeah.
Now we've got to start thinking again, and you see it, right? You've seen it happen. You saw it happen with schools. Like, we're going to go remote for the rest of the years. And now, homie, you're going remote for the next 18 months. You just don't know it yet.
That's right.
So it's like, but those two are two very, very different approaches that require very, very different systems to be built. Totally different, right? So I think when summer hit and we started to say, okay, then like the questions become very, very different. They become very real, right? This after school thing that we thought we were going to do, nope, it looks totally different now, right? This summer camp that we thought we were going to do, nope, That didn't materialize, right? So all those pieces become very existential, and then, but the needs don't change,
No, that's right.
right? Children are still children that need all the things that children need. Families are still families and need all the things that families need. So with none of that changing, then you got to figure out, okay, well, how do I adjust? I can't ask them to not eat anymore. I can't ask them to not learn anymore. I can't ask them to not grow. So now I have to change. So what are my priorities, right? What can I do to sort of continue to meet those needs? So I think that's a big piece that I would, continually be turning over in front of my brain.
I think that's a great one. That's great. Well, thank you very much for talking with me. This was
My absolute pleasure.
always love talking to you, and I'll talk to you.
Always a pleasure. Take care.